This is Dr. Ekashri Patel from Foster Physio and Sports Surat. Today we have Dr. Chashnal Rathod from Mumbai. She is one of the frontliner in this COVID-19 and she has also operated COVID-19 positive case few days back. So we'll be thankful to her at the end of the session. Without wasting time, we'll start session first. Okay, so welcome ma'am. Please start
Yeah,
with
so hi. So hello everyone, and thank you to join us here today afternoon. So I'm thankful to Dr. Hetashri for starting this lovely set of webinars, and I hope everyone is enjoying the lockdown with this. So today we are going to be discussing, I think this is one of the last sessions. So basically principles or surgical guidelines in cerebral palsy. And so we are going to have, we see that it is most of the time people feel that cerebral palsy is such a confusing thing. And it's like many a times people tend to say it like it's like a confusing palsy. But if we go through it in a very organized manner, probably the decision making won't be very confusing, and we could probably reach to a very perfect decision making to understand what works best for which child. So as we all know that it is a non-progressive condition, and what gets affected is mainly the movement and posture. And along with that, we could have some other problems with the brain functions like the speech, auditory, visual, or mental deficits. So if we grossly classify this, so we need to classify the CP even for the treatment aspect. So there could be a physiological classification depending on which part of brain is involved. So the spastic cerebral palsy have very good outcome post procedures or surgeries, while the dyskinetic or ataxic may not give very good outcome post surgery. So that's why it's important to know where the site of lesion is and what type of physiological classification the child sits in. And second is the anatomical classification, where which part of the limb is involved. Is it just a single limb, that is a monoplegia? Is it one particular unilateral or hemiplegic CP? Because when we classify these kids in their gait patterns, we can further classify what kind of treatment they need. So anatomical classification is equally important. Or is it diplegic? So diplegic is not necessarily just the lower limbs involved. Diplegics is where all the four limbs are involved, but lower limbs are involved more than the upper limbs, which will differentiate it from quadriplegic. And triplegic is a child where there could be an asymmetric diplegia with one of the upper extremity involved. So either we could call it triplegic or asymmetrical diplegia with upper extremity involved. And a quadriplegic, we all know, where both upper and lower extremities are involved equally, with trunk and even neck involvement will also be present. So quickly to go through the pathophysiology, we all know that why it is important to know the pathophysiology, because at each point we would correct the each of these pathophysiology. And if we know where to correct the child, we might not progress to more bony abnormalities. So primarily we start with an increased spasticity, which we know which we can correct with Botox. And if we don't address this spasticity, it can lead to contractures. So these contractures further, they lead to tertiary problems, which are the torsional malalignment or the joint instability. So a spasticity can hamstring spasticity can cause a knee flexion deformity, and a persistent knee flexion deformity can cause in-toeing or a coxa valga, which in long run can cause a hip dislocation. So that's why we need to understand the primary, secondary, and the tertiary problems, and when we can address those problems. So basically, approaching a child with cerebral palsy is a team approach, and an alone orthopedician is not the one who's treating the child. So the first person to see could be a pediatrician, then an NDT therapist, followed by a neurologist maybe, or in any order, one of us would be seeing this child. So it is important to know that we alone don't treat a child, and we need to understand that it is a full, like a whole family along with the physio, and the entire treating team is involved, and we need all of us to set goals. So the goals have to be set in terms what the therapist feels, what expectations the family has, and what the surgeon has in their mind. And if we together set a right goal, I think we can decide what works best for the child. And goal setting has to be like at different stages. There could be a early primary goal setting, then a goal setting for 6 months, or long term and short term, whichever way we need to fix, but we need to have a common plan altogether. So my goals as a surgeon are that I don't cure or correct CP totally, but I just want to help the child in the developmental phase of growth. I want that the child should be independent and self-sufficient, especially kids who are ambulatory. They should have a good quality of life if they are non-ambulators. And lastly, we should be avoiding the secondary or tertiary bony abnormalities, which need more bigger, extensive surgeries. So, how do we approach these kids as a surgeon? We follow this diagnostic matrix. So, this was devised. This term was devised by Dr. Professor John Davids, and he's one of my mentor and teachers. So, we classify the child based on all these points. So, a clinical history and evaluation, a radiology, a GMFCS level, a gait analysis, and examination under anesthesia is what comprises of diagnostic matrix. And such diagnostic matrix is devised for each of the joint levels. So like here I have pasted a diagnostic matrix for knee. There is a diagnostic matrix for hip. There's a diagnostic matrix for foot as well. And it gives us very clear guidelines what needs to be done with the child when they have similar problems. So a history is, of course, important. We all take a very detailed history when it comes to developmental delay or tone problems, or if we are seeing an older child whom we have already know has cerebral palsy. A standardized physical examination, like we all know, is again very much important. But all the major surgical guidelines, along with this three, that is X-rays, CT scans, and other things, we need GMFCS levels, we need FMS level, and we need to know the just 2D gait pattern of the child to reach to a treatment guideline. So why GMFCS is very important? I know most of the therapists here are totally aware about the GMFCS level. What we use currently, the gross motor function classification system, is an extended and revised classification system, and we can easily use this classification system in children who are above 4 years. There are different classification systems even for younger children, but we grossly know that 1, 2, 3 are ambulators and 4 and 5 are non-ambulators. So that too, in 1, 2, and 3, we can break them down who walk without limitation. So these are kids who go to school on their own, who can walk in the mall, who can cross roads, who can go out in the public. Level 2 is they might have some limitations. So if they go in a crowded place, they might be a little scared and they need a hand to hold or they need a support. Level 3 could be who needs an ambulatory, be a walker, a crutch, or maybe at times it can be even a motorized wheelchair which the child can manage by themselves. So it's just like needing a support. And 4 and 5 are more non-ambulatory types with loss of trunk and head neck control in GMFCS 5 level. So why this GMFCS 5 level is GMFCS levels are important? Because most of the times we always get the parents asking us, when will my child walk, or will my child ever walk independently? Now this is the question we see very often in the OPD, and this is like, how are we supposed to tell the future of the child? So yes, we can certainly tell the future of the child by looking at the GMFCS levels. So if the child has attained standing with support by age 4, and if they have established a walking pattern by age 8, so if the child has attained this thing by age 8 or 6 to 8, between 6 to 8, then we know that even in future this child is going to be an ambulatory child. But if they have not attained walking by age 6 or standing with support by age 6, then we shouldn't promise the parents that yes, your child is going to be walking in the future. So this is a little difficult thing. And how have we reached to this sentence? I mean, there has been an extensive study done by plotting GMFM. So we all know that GMFM is a 100 score system, and that GMFM has been plotted with the age, and which shows that normally to begin with, all the kids have different milestones to start. So at different age, but by age 6, they all plateau. So whatever happens at age 6 remains lifelong. So this is what has come out through various studies by studying many kids who have CP, and then they have come to this magic number of 6, which shows that if the child was GMFCS level 5 at age 6, he's going to remain 5 throughout the lifelong. Same is for GMFCS level 1, 2, 3, 4, whichever way. So whatever it is at age 6 is going to remain like that only. So it is, the GMFCS is important for prognostic. Also, it is important for a surgical intervention. So anytime if I notice, or if a therapist notice that the GMFCS level 2 child is falling to GMFCS level 3. So any deterioration in the level of GMFCS is a time we need to do surgical intervention. That means something is going wrong and the child is deteriorating. So that's why the GMFCS is very important when we consider prognosis and surgical intervention. So let's see more of these details, and let's try to fix how we need to put what surgical guideline for what pattern. So coming from GMFCS, we could also classify the child with an FMS scoring system. And then we going to quickly see the sagittal gait pattern. So why gait patterns are important? So in hemiplegic CP, we all know that Miller has classified this hemiplegic gait pattern. So if we describe the gait pattern grossly by looking at the child in the sagittal plane, that is by looking at the child walking from the sideways. So we can classify the child and accordingly treat the child. So a type 1 hemiplegic gait is where there is a foot drop. There is a weak dorsiflexor. There might not be a tight gastroc. So here what we need is to just support the feet with a orthosis, and it should be sufficient. Type 2 gait is where there is equinus and only the gastroc is involved. And here we need to treat the gastroc with the help of maybe Botox or a surgery. A type 3 gait is where there is equinus and also there is flexion of knee, because the hamstring is also in spasticity or in contracture along with the gastrosoleus. And also the antagonist muscle, that is the rectus, could be having spasticity. So here we need to address the gastroc along with the hamstring. And type 4 gait is where along with the equinus and knee flexion, there will be even hip flexion. So this gait will also have a hip flexion deformity along with adductor spasticity. So there will be an adduction deformity as well as a flexion deformity at the hip. So that's how we would classify them in type 1, type 2, type 3 or type 4. It's easier to talk in this terminologies because then we know exactly what muscles are affected and to classify them so that they can be treated accordingly. So that was for hemiplegics. But for diplegics, we don't have type 1, 2, 3, 4, but we all know that there are different terminologies like the equinus gait pattern, where the knees are straight and only the ankle is in equinus. So here the equinus could be stiff equinus or correctable equinus depending on how the gastrosoleus is involved. If it's only spasticity, then we can of course correct it with an AFO. But if it's a contracture, then it will need a surgery. Jump knee gait is where there is an equinus as well as there is a flexion of the knee joint. So here there will be involvement of the gastrosoleus as well as the hamstrings. So here again, depending on how the muscle length is or the tone is, it could be addressed. Apparent equinus is when there is no equinus. So the ankle could be in neutral position or it could be in slightly dorsiflexion position. It can be secondary to a midfoot break also. So apparent equinus is not actually an equinus, but it is an equinus because the knee is bending forward and the heel is being pulled up. So we need to look at the angle of the tibia and the foot. And if it is not in more than 90 degrees, then it's an apparent equinus. And second, when this ankle goes in dorsiflexion, that will be a crouch gait. So there will be flexion at knee joint, there will be flexion at hip joint, and there will be dorsiflexion at the ankle level. So depending on what joint level or the muscles which are crossing these joints are involved, the surgical treatment would be addressed accordingly. So we all know that most of these muscles are biarticular muscles which are causing these deformities, and that's how every time as the child grows, and as we look at the natural history, we see the equinus child goes into a jump knee gait, and then the jump knee gait goes into apparent equinus, and eventually they might go into a crouch gait if they become heavy, if they develop midfoot break, or if they are untreated, they don't wear splints or they don't do therapy. So this could be also a natural history if the child doesn't undergo any treatment. So what would we basically address in terms of management? So again, it's like a teamwork. So always everyone doesn't need a surgery, and some could need just a basic bracing and everything would be good. Secondly, even most of the kids do well with therapy, which you all are totally aware of. And then there could be mild cases where just oral medications like a baclofen and Pacitan, which you have already gone through with Dr. Ritesh already, and I think he must have told you. So even that helps very well in kids. Smaller and very milder procedures like serial casting, which include injection botulinum toxin or not, is also very much helpful. And then bigger surgeries, which are further divided based on ambulatory status and non-ambulatory status. So how do we divide the surgeries? So surgeries, like I said, will again be involving GMFCS level. Like I told in the beginning, that if the GMFCS level is falling, we need to maintain it. So we have to always maintain the ambulator in the ambulatory status and maintain the quality of life in the non-ambulatory child. So henceforth, we'll be talking about surgery in terms of GMFCS levels and their ambulatory status. Okay, so coming at the first thing, like I said, many of the times the bracing could be helpful. So how bracing is helpful? So if you look at this child, he walks with sort of a crouch gait. It doesn't look purely crouch gait, but yeah, there is a lot of weakness in this child and nothing has been done. Just simple solid AFO has been put onto the child and the child walking straight. So it is the same session in which the child has walked barefoot and then the child is walking with a solid AFO. And you can notice that how the gait has suddenly improved, how the AFO has helped in getting the knee straight by acting as a check rein at the knee joint and helping the child get upright. So that's how, not necessary, maybe somebody who's not aware of principles of management would want to do an hamstring lengthening here, and this child who is already trying to walk well off might become more bad by that procedure. So always trying a child AFO before planning any procedure helps us to decide whether a procedure is actually needed or not. So the next thing is, apart from how the procedures have to be planned, and they are based mainly again on the age. So Botox will work with younger children where there is no contractures have developed. So this is classically between age 3, the peak is between age 3 to age 7. Once the child grows older or the child becomes obese, then the requirement of the Botox dose also increases, and Botox has a toxicity level. So we can't inject more than 300 units Botox to any child. And suppose if the child is 40 kgs, then every muscle will require some amount of Botox, and giving a smaller dose of Botox is not going to help again. So depending, that's why younger kids benefit very well from Botox, and the older kids would benefit from contracture surgery or deformity correction surgeries. So mainly what would be the indications for Botox is that getting a near normal gait pattern. Anytime you feel that the ankle is stretchable or the knee is stretchable, but there is spasticity and you would like to correct that part. So a Botox injection with a stretch cast could help correct that deformity, and along with that we are preventing secondary deformities. So if we correct the equinus, which is again correctable, we avoid the midfoot break. Similarly, if we correct early crouch or early knee flexion or hamstring spasticity, we can avoid a knee contracture. And for upper extremity, there could be multiple goals for doing a Botox, and upper extremity has more muscles involved and many muscles, so there could be a different role for Botox totally. So how this helps is we pick up the right muscle, we do the right dosage, and we do the right technique, and only then we are going to get a very good outcome from the Botox injection. If any of these three things is missing out, then probably we might not get a very good outcome with the Botox injection. So just showing you a quick example, this is a right hemiplegic CP child, and she has received Botox in her pronator teres at a very young age. She's like 4 or 5, and if you see, the pronation has, the supination has improved very well. So if we just leave it the pronation deformity like this, or the pronator teres spasticity just like that, then we can further progress into a pronation contracture, and then treating this is quite difficult. So, or secondly, treating a child who's walking on toes. So this is a child walking on toes, and a simple gastro Botox can help get him his toes down and further prevent contracture of the gastro muscle. So coming to the next part of this, that is the surgical part. So now we are going to look at each of these GMFCS level 1, 2, 3, and why and when do we need surgeries in each of these child. So in 1, 2, and 3 levels, we need to do any procedures to maintain the mobility, to avoid contractures, to avoid malalignment, and finally do some gait correction surgeries. So these will be our aims in 1, 2, 3 in all the ambulatory kids. So the Botox, and second is single event multi-level surgery. So all these things are just to optimize the walking pattern of the child and improve the gait pattern. So this was a 3-year-old child, which I just showed you, who has undergone Botox with an equinus gait. And second way of optimizing gait pattern is doing a basic single event multi-level surgery. So this is a 10-year-old child who's diplegic, and he's a GMFCS 2/3, because in a isolated or an empty room he can walk without support, but in a crowded place he might need a walker. And a simple hamstring lengthening has made him walk upright and straight, and has brought very good improvement. So if you look at him, his speed has improved, his balance has improved, and he's walking very well. So this looks like an apparent equinus here. If you have a look here, we feel that the ankle is going up. So someone again who feels here that the gastroc is tight, and lengthening a gastroc here would be the worst mistake. So here it is just a simple hamstring lengthening which can optimize the gait pattern. So no gastroc lengthening is indicated here. Again, in hamstring, only medial hamstring lengthening is done. Anytime a lateral hamstring lengthening is going to cause disaster. And if you look at this child who had presented, he was operated elsewhere, and he had undergone a lateral hamstrings, that is a biceps femoris lengthening as well. And if you see, there is so much, he now walks with truncal, lot of truncal swaying, there is no knee flexion, there's a lot of recurvatum, lot of forward bending of the trunk. So this is like an iatrogenic stiff knee gait pattern which the child has got because of over lengthening of hamstring, and particularly the lateral hamstring. Had he only undergone the medial hamstring lengthening, he would have been walking as good as that child which I showed previously. Okay. So again, no TA lengthenings or TA tenotomy have to be performed in any of these kids. We know that in many camp settings or places where a lot of kids are operated in as free of cost surgeries, there many of the times a TA tenotomy or TA lengthening is done. And this is one of the worst surgeries which could be done in a CP child. This is a total contraindicated surgery in any child with cerebral palsy. And this causes an iatrogenic crouch, which is very difficult to treat. And hence all the TA gastroc lengthening procedures have to be performed at the musculotendinous junction and not in the tendinous areas. So any procedure which is done here is going to give this bad crouch, which is very difficult to correct. And it causes a lot of weakness and difficulty in push off, and many events of gait cycle get affected because of these procedures. So, and many a times a child might become totally non-ambulatory as well because of doing this procedure. So all procedures pertaining to equinus have to be performed in a musculotendinous level, this junction, and not anywhere below towards the heel. Again, doing tendon transfer in a very young child is not advisable because it is going to lead to opposite deformities. This was a child with a very basic equinovarus deformity who was treated with tibialis anterior total tendon transfer, which is again not indicated in cerebral palsy, and this should not be done as part of single event multi-level surgeries anytime. And if you look at this, now the child is walking with so much of valgus of the feet, and this is like 3-4 years ago when I saw this child first. Now this child is grown up and the feet are really bad. And I feel sorry that this tendon transfer was done for him at this very young age, which is totally again contraindicated and is not recommended. So what are the other surgeries apart from a single event multi-level surgery? So there could be crouch correction surgery. So you must have seen the children who are little older, like age 12, 14, they walk like this. And these are malalignment. This can be a malalignment. If we look in the coronal plane, there could be rotational problems. So this is a classic crouch gait where the ankle, if you see, is in neutral or dorsiflexion. And this is post femur osteotomy and patellar tendon shortening procedure. So this was an 11-year-old child. He underwent two set of procedures. That is first hamstring lengthening and followed by bony procedure. And you look at him and he has really worked hard. I mean, he and his physio, they have done a wonderful job. And that's how we have got such a good result. So alone surgery doesn't give us such a good results, because post this osteotomy, it takes at least 4 months to get the child walking with support, with a walker and AFO. This is like a long-term follow-up. That's why this looks so good. But if we look at serial follow-ups at 1 year, 2 year, there is an abductor weakness, there is slight forward bending of the trunk, the pelvis has not yet aligned well, and the power is not so very good. But here the child now walks very comfortably, and these are the last resort of surgeries which are done in older kids with crouch gait. So these are mainly bony procedures which are performed. Again, apart from the knee, when we see the foot is very important in terms of stability, in terms of placing the first foot forward when we walk and when we do a heel strike. It is important that we have a stable heel strike. And anytime the child who has walked on toes as a kid is going to develop a midfoot break, and when they grow up, they are going to have bad, unstable subtalar joints. There's going to be a lot of problems with the mid-tarsal joint. There could be a talonavicular subluxation, short lateral column, and subtalar instability. So getting the foot in corrected position and getting the foot in a stable position and not having instability at the subtalar joint is again very important to get the child walking straight. So this is the right side foot is operated and he's waiting for the left side surgery. So if you look at it, a simple subtalar fusion was performed. This is the scar here, and how the foot becomes really good and stable and a heel strike is possible by a simple foot procedure. We saw that all this time in the ambulatory kids, we are trying to just optimize the gait pattern, make the gait pattern more or less energy consuming gait pattern, so that the child can walk or take more steps without getting tired. And most importantly, if the child is deteriorating in terms of GMFCS, we improve their GMFCS level, like from 3, try to get them to 2, and from 2, try to make them 1. So now for the non-ambulators, mostly all of the procedures are going to be addressing their comorbidities, improving their postures, improving the sitting balance, improve the perineal hygiene and care, and improve quality of life. So we all know that in a GMFCS 4 or 5, you must have seen that we don't see equinus in them. We don't see early knee contractures in them. But what we see more commonly is very early hip problems in them. And then that's why all this, the last 3 are important, particularly the perineal hygiene and care, the sitting balance, and the posture improvement. So first is treating the associated comorbidities. So this you have been already seeing in your previous webinars as well, how to get treated for seizures or feeding problems or visual and speech problems. And apart from these kids have a lot of nutritional problems as well, like vitamin D deficiency, which cause a lot of pathological fractures or bone pains or painful sessions in therapy. There could be vitamin C deficiency, which are known to cause physeal slips in cerebral palsy kids. And then other problems like drooling, along with the speech and visual problems. So I'm aware that most of the therapists you all already treat many of these issues, and the child is also undergoing a multidisciplinary approach and is being treated for all of these comorbidities. So like I said, the hip subluxation is one of the most common problem if we look at GMFCS 4 and 5 kids. And again, see, this is the amount of migration percentage. So the migration percentage is the percentage which the hip is outside the acetabulum, which we'll see in subsequent slides. And if you look at GMFCS 4 and 5 level, the migration percentages are like 70 and 90. So 90 is almost a dislocated hip, and 70 is like almost a hip which is about to dislocate. So GMFCS 4 and 5 levels already have a very high preponderance towards dislocating or subluxating hips as compared to the ambulatory kids. So this is how the migration percentage is calculated. So if you look at the acetabulum and then you draw a line at the lateral edge of the acetabulum and you draw a line at the capital femoral epiphysis or the head of the femur, and whatever amount is outside is the dislocated part or the subluxated part. How we calculate the percentage? It is you divide this distance by this distance and multiply by 100. That will give us the migration percentage. I will show you one of the app which every one of you can download in your phone, which is like really important app, and we discuss about that. So what we do with this migration percentage? So all of us, like normally we could have a migration percentage of 20% or even up to 30% who have had some sort of dysplasia as kids. But if in a CP child, the migration percentage is more than 30 or 20, so particularly 30, we would want to do some adductor lengthening or a psoas lengthening. And if the migration percentages are even more, like here 50 to 75, then it might need a bony reconstruction, because if you look at this neck shaft angle, it is not a normal neck shaft angle. This is almost a 90-degree angle, and what we have classically is 110 to 130 degrees of neck shaft angle. So if we look at this child, so if you see this kid, so this is a child which is again having a neck shaft angle which is almost 100, and we see that there is subluxation. This side hip is normal hip and this is almost subluxating. It has almost subluxated 80%. So this would again need a procedure. Maybe we do a medial release and then a bony procedure. So these are classic procedures which are usually performed. So a simple medial release. Here in this hip, if you see a medial release and a varus and derotation is given because the neck shaft angle has gone bad. And in this case, here the hip is rotated. So after reducing the hip, the neck shaft angle looked good, and just a derotation was needed. So when the hamstrings are very tight, or when the medial muscles like the adductor longus, gracilis, and all the hams are tight, they try to pull the entire femur internally, which causes this intorsion, and subsequently this causes this dislocation. So that's how these things, they need to be, this femur which has gone into lot of internal rotation and subsequently this tertiary deformities need this derotation so that the femur can turn outward and we can have ample space in the perineal region for perineal hygiene. So if you look at this child, this is a quadriplegic child who has undergone that derotation osteotomy, and how the sitting posture and everything subsequently improves with the procedure. Similarly, this is another child with encephalitis. This is not a very classic CP child, but and they had a lot of this severe ankle equinus, and just a simple gastrosoleus lengthening has been done at this level. So this has made the feet more splintable, and this has helped the therapist in getting the child into a more upright position, getting him on a standing board, getting him in a sitting position in a 90-90 pose, or helping him for rehabilitation. So again, all these procedures are basically, we know they are not going to help the child walk anytime, but yes, they help in rehabilitation. They help in splinting the feet. If we leave these feet just like this, they're going to develop, in some time, they're going to have a lot of dislocation at the talus and the ankle joint, and they're going to have painful ankles, and it is going to be like really late, at later stage, treating the bad ankles with a bony osteotomy is much more painful, and much more immobilization is needed compared to when we treat them early with simple muscular procedures. So if you have a very long standing hip dislocation, like this is a very older child, and if you look at this hip, so they had this hip dislocation since many years, and once the hip starts dislocating, And when the hip is not, the femoral head is not in the joint, then the cartilage starts getting destroyed. And this denuded cartilage has a lot of nerve endings at its end, and it is very painful. So this can lead to loss of sleep, loss of appetite, and even cause a lot of other secondary problems in children. So they could have seizures. If suppose a child is having epilepsy and they start having this kind of hip dislocation, and this pain could be one of the trigger for seizures again. So in these cases, putting the hip back in is going to lead to a very painful and stiff hip. Instead, a head resection is done and an additional pelvic support osteotomy is done, so that the femur doesn't go up, or the overriding or the high riding of the femur doesn't happen towards the pelvis. And secondly, this is important in the this pelvic support is important because we maintain a pelvic obliquity. Suppose if the hip is dislocated, what we get is a oblique pelvis, which secondarily gives a neuromuscular scoliosis. So just a head resection without doing a PSO will again give us a bad spinal deformity, which would be a secondary deformities. And because the hip and spine are connected with the pelvis, we need to do that additional pelvic support osteotomy here, so that the pelvis tries to remain at one level, and we don't give an additional neuromuscular scoliosis in such children. So if suppose the child has a scoliosis to start, even in that case, with the scoliosis, there can be a secondarily hip dislocation, because once the spine starts turning towards one particular side, so maybe it's an asymmetric CP or a quadriplegic child, and then one of the side muscles are weaker and one of the side muscles are spastic. So it's going to cause scoliosis, slowly progressing into more bad deformity. And once the pelvic starts getting oblique, the hip starts getting uncovering. So again, in these cases, the spine needs to be operated, followed by the hip surgery. So this is one of the app which I mentioned to you, and I would suggest that all the physiotherapists and all the healthcare workers who treat cerebral palsy should have this app on their phone, because hip surveillance is one of the most important topics to avoid hip dislocation in children with cerebral palsy. So the name of the app is Hip Screen, and it's available on Android as well as iOS. So it gives us grossly three things. One is at what particular ages we need to do the hip X-ray for the child. It helps us to identify the hip surveillance schedule for the child. And secondly, if you have no time to calculate the migration percentage, or if you think your mathematics is not so great, you just hold the screen over the X-ray and you can calculate the migration percentage by just holding the mobile over the X-ray. So the app is a wonderful app. I myself use it. And grossly, if we see the GMFCS 1 and 2, they need X-rays at 2, 4, 6, 8 years. So this is the mota age when we need X-rays for child, GMFCS 1 and 2. 3 would need more X-rays after age 4. So after age 4, they would need X-rays every year. So it's like we put a reminder to the parents that every birthday or every some occasion in a year, you need to get an X-ray done, so that we don't have to do those big hip surgeries. Those hip surgeries, they look very neat in the X-ray, but it takes a very long time to do these surgeries. They're very morbid surgeries. The child goes into a spica. There's a lot of blood loss. So apart from the intraoperative and post-operative recovery and all the problems, hip surveillance is still an easier method rather than doing all that, I would feel. So it is very important that all the healthcare workers who are treating a CP child should have this app. So lastly, I would say that for the dystonics, it's a quite different story, and we don't grade them into this GMFCS thing or the surgical guidelines, which we would otherwise follow for the spastic children. So the surgical outcomes in these kids are very guarded. Suppose there's a dystonic child who's walking with a equinus, and we do a gastrosoleus lengthening for the child can go in calcaneus, or the child might go in some very weird deformity and just stop walking also. So these kids, they don't do well with soft tissue procedures, and the most minimal intervention procedures like a stretch cast or Botox helps. Newer procedures like selective motor fasciculotomies are very good for children who are dystonics. So, and yes, medications are again very much helpful with dystonics. So if we look at this child, yeah, so This child is walking with the shoulder in extension, and suddenly the elbow goes in extension when there's a lot of crowd around him. Or even if you look at this girl, she had a flex, she was walking with crouch, and she went to a camp for surgeries, and they did a hamstring and gastric lengthening for the surgeries. And now if you see, she has a calcaneus, and if we look at her from side, she has really bad recurvatum at the knee joints, and it's not a very good thing to do a muscle procedures in dystonic. So any dystonic should be like one of the last patient where a surgery should be advised. And if at all any surgery is needed, it should be done at the nerves and not at the muscle. And I have learned some of these surgeries from Purohit sir, whom we all know, who has been past president of ICP, and he's a neurosurgeon basically, but he does this very beautiful motor fasciculotomies. So from the entire nerve, we select one particular fascicle for that muscle which is causing a lot of dystonia, and that nerve is divided, which gives very good results. So I think the selective motor fasciculotomies are more better procedures in dystonics rather than a muscle or a bony procedure. So lastly, to conclude, I would say that GMFCS is a very important tool for classifying the kids in terms of their mobilities level. Secondly, it also gives us the prognosis of the child, that will the child walk in future or not. And thirdly, as a surgeon, it helps us in planning when the intervention should be needed. So many a times we look at the child and we say, okay, you carry on with therapy, maybe 3 more months you can do therapy, because we know that the GMFCS level is not falling. So the child can still continue with the therapy, and maybe we could get very good improvement also, and a surgery can be totally avoided. So that's how it helps us to decide that. Secondly, we don't want the GMFCS level to fall anytime, and anytime it's falling, it's time for an intervention in way of maybe a splint or maybe some medication or maybe some surgery. And thirdly, we need to decide the dosage of surgery. All the kids are going to have similar looking gait patterns, but their surgeries could vary depending on a very detailed clinical evaluation, gait examination, and radiological examination, which the diagnostic matrix helps us. And lastly, importantly, it's a teamwork. So a patient, family, the caregivers, which we all are, should all have common goals, and then only we can make the child better in whatever condition the child is. And lastly, we have to do no harm. So all the surgeries which are contraindicated should be totally be no for the child, and everyone should be aware that what procedures are not supposed to be done. And even as physios, I have seen many physios, they are like a family to the child and their family. So we are all like a family usually when we treat cerebral palsy, and we guide parents. So even when they want to do a surgery, probably the physios are the first one whom the parents want to come and ask that should we go ahead with this surgery. And maybe you know that what kind of surgery is going to actually help the child and not. So maybe you can always guide them that this surgery probably is not indicated, and we should talk to the surgeon, or maybe get a opinion done, or maybe have a discussion about it. So if we have time, we can do quick some 4 or 5 slides about upper extremity surgical principles.
Yeah, sure.
Dr.
Yeah, sure, sure.
So, okay. So lastly, I would say that when we say that it's a very confusing palsy, I would say no, it's not. If we are very a clear and proactive team, and I should say that we are very lucky to have a wonderful team at Jupiter Cerebral Palsy. I have a very wonderful head of the department and a very great team together, which we have helped many kids with cerebral palsy. And this kid I'm going to show you with the upper extremity evaluation. So she was a child who came to our clinic crawling. She was a 18-year-old when she visited us. She's a triplegic CP. She's undergone 3 procedures, for 2 for the lower extremity and 1 for the upper extremity. And now I think we have really helped her gain a lot of confidence in her life. And recently this kid she has done a nice 1 kilometer marathon with us in the December Disability Day run. And we really feel proud for bringing smiles on this kid's faces. So I think we can now just quickly do few slides for the upper extremity, like in very quick. So yeah, so actually upper extremity is more complex than lower extremity, what I feel. And for the upper extremity, again, we have many different evaluations and different surgical intervention needed. So mainly I'll show you one case, the kid which I showed you. So it's going to be a case-based quick surgical principles. So our goal is to improve the function in this child for the upper extremity, improve in facilitation of care of the fingers and web spaces. Sometimes the deformities are so bad that they just can't open their fingers, and they have a lot of sweating and hygiene issues are there in the web space or in the fist especially. And at times pain reduction, when we see very bad like flexion at the wrist, there could be arthritis at the wrist joint, and there could be pain in these joints. And again, our goal is to do the pain reduction. And secondly, improving the overall hand position improves the self-esteem in the child and confidence of the child, like we saw this girl earlier. And indications could be, again, there could be contractures, there is inability of the overpowering spastic. So there is a muscle which is overpowering, which is a spastic muscle, and then there is a weak muscle. So in this case, we need to balance these by doing tendon transfers. So like tendon transfers are contraindicated in lower limb, but they are like one of the best tools for upper limb to help in getting a very good upper limb function. So again, the child should have very good cognition to do any upper extremity surgery. If the child doesn't have good cognition, and if the child doesn't have a good selective motor control, none of the upper extremity surgeries are going to work well. And that stands well for the lower extremity surgeries also. If the selective motor control is poor, then we can't help the kid getting a very good ambulatory status again. Okay, so most of the surgical interventions are aimed at tendon lengthening. So we see there are very bad contractures, and simple musculotendinous tendon lengthening could help us get the wrist and fingers in a very functional position. Then there could be tendon transfers. So slight, if suppose there's a slight ulnar flexion and ulnar deviation, a simple fractional lengthening of FCU can get us a very good wrist movement and can get us a very good functional looking wrist. But if there's a severe deformity and we see that the extensors are very weak and the flexor carpi ulnaris is very strong, in that case, to balance and to give a good function, a tendon transfer is much more better as compared to a tendon lengthening. And then in very severe deformities, like I said, a fusion of the wrist joint would be much more better. So this is for pain reduction, basically when in older, like young adults, specifically 18, 19, 20, who have had severe deformities at the wrist, and we know that a tendon transfer is not going to help. Only they need these kind of salvage procedures. Otherwise, these are more functional procedures. So these are all lot of procedures which are described for upper extremity, but the ones which I have highlighted are the ones which are commonly done. So I'll show you this kid, and just like we call single event multi-level surgeries of lower extremities, it is called single event multi-level surgery of upper extremity. So she was 18 when she came to us. She underwent lower limb procedures, and now she wanted to hold on to a walker to walk. And then we had to give her a functional upper extremity, and that's how she underwent the hand procedures, third in order. So if you look at it, the wrist is hyperflexed, the thumb is into flexion. She had callosity because she was crawling. There is a lot of swan neck deformity. The wrist is again in flexion here, and she's able to get the wrist slightly up here, but there's a lot of flexion. The thumb is unstable again. The MCP doesn't look very stable, and the resting position is always in flexion. She has a flexion deformity of nearly more than 45 degrees. And supination is quite good. Terminal mild supination is restricted. So for the elbow, I have done a simple elbow brachialis muscle lengthening. So you see this fascia here. So only the fascia of the brachialis is divided, and it leads to improvement in the flexion deformity. For the pronator, so this is the pronator muscle which comes and gets attached to the radial border. So from here, the pronator is detached and it is pushed upwards till we get the full supination. This is called pronator teres recession. So first the pronator was attached here. Now I have pushed it really far up towards the elbow, and then fixed the forearm in supination in a plaster for 3 weeks. And it is, if the supinator power is again very good, we are going to have very good supination in the child post-operatively. For the thumb, we saw that the thumb is adducted, the thumb was hyperflexed, there was instability at the thumb, and the metacarpal joint didn't look very good. So the thumb needs a lot of reconstruction, and the thumb will need taking away the tight muscle, which is the adductor pollicis muscle. So this is the adductor pollicis muscle. So this is removed. So once we remove the adductor muscle, now we need something which will abduct the thumb, which will also extend the thumb. We saw in one of the slides, the child had difficulty extending the thumb. That's why it was going in a weird hyperextension deformity. So to balance that, the EPL, the extensor pollicis tendon, is rerouted. So normally it is in the third compartment. So it is removed from the third compartment, like you see here, and it is taken in the first compartment. So now the adductor pollicis becomes an extensor as well as an abductor. So all this thumb needs a lot of reconstruction actually. And then this is the FCU, which has been removed and transferred to the extensor carpi radialis, so to the extensors of the wrist. And the swan neck deformity needs correction by extensor tendon tenotomies. And we look at the post-op. So you look at the thumb here, it is hyperextended and it is adducted. So you look here, she's able to abduct well. And now that her deformity has improved, her callosity is also gone. She no more keeps the wrist flexed all the time. So the callosity is gone. The wrist, before it was quite flexed, and now the wrist looks quite good. We'll see in other positions. So supination active has become so good. Here, this was passive. And if you look at the thumb function, see the thumb has become really nice. Here she had difficulty in grabbing onto things. The thumb was in hyperextension. And now this is the transferred tendon, which adds to the thumb function. And the elbow deformity has improved so well. So this is how the child was. And now with some multiple small single event multi-level surgeries at the upper extremity, she's able to hold the walker very nicely. And we of course saw her achievements. So that was for the upper extremity.